So the title of this movie should have been The Film That Wouldn't Die. It was re-released so many times in the 1960s, they had to come up with a myriad of posters to cover it as a repeat. Now, The Man Who Could Cheat Death, one of the most underrated Hammer movies of all time, came out in 59, directed by Terence Fisher and starring Anton Diffring, Hazel Court, and the great Christopher Lee. Jimmy Sangster adapted a screenplay from the play The Man in Half Moon Street by Barry Lyndon, which had been previously filmed in 1945. The Man Who Could Cheat Death was produced by Carrasses and Keys for Hammer. It was released on the 19th of August, 59 in the US and on November 30th, 59 UK. Now, in Paris in 1990, Dr. Georges Bonnet, a doctor and hobbyist sculptor, abruptly ends the fashionable party he's hosting. Georges harbors a secret. Though he appears to be in his mid-30s, he is actually 104 years old and has kept his youth and vitality through parathoid gland transplants every 10 years. Professor Ludwig Weiss of Vienna discovered his anti-aging process, is 3 weeks late in arriving at George's home to perform the last transplant. As a result, George must drink a steaming green elixir every 6 hours to stay young, though the elixir only buys him 4 weeks without the transplant. When George's latest model, Margot Philippe, comes across George drinking the fluid, he strikes her down. When the 89-year-old Ludwig finally arrives, he reveals he will be unable to operate on George because a stroke has incapacitated his right hand. Ludwig instructs George to find another surgeon. Now, Sûreté Inspector Legris begins to investigate Margot's disappearance and arrives at a dinner party hosted by George for Janine Dubois, a former lover, and Dr. Pierre Girard. George denies knowing Margot's whereabouts, and when Legris asks to see the bust of Margot, tells him that he accidentally destroyed it that morning. Legris leaves, and George admits to his startling guest that he lied, as the police would probably damage the bus if he turned it over to them. Secretly, Ludwig convinces Pierre to perform the transplant surgery, claiming that George is deathly ill and is urgent need of treatment. Now, after Janine and Pierre have left, Ludwig tells George that Pierre will operate. However, Ludwig has grown suspicious of George and says it was strange that it is the third of George's models who has gone missing around the time of his transplants. Ludwig discovers that the newest parathoid gland is from a living person instead of being revitalized from a corpse. When Ludwig confronts George that his actions are unjustified, George retorts that he revitalized 4 glands from corpses, but they all died because Ludwig was late, adding to George's hatred of being alone in the world. Ludwig destroys the elixir to prevent George from continuing, and as a result, George strangles Ludwig to death. Now, Pierre arrives the following morning to perform the operation, but George tells him that Ludwig was unexpectedly called back to Vienna. Pierre refuses to carry on and suggests that George find another surgeon. George visits other surgeons in Paris to no avail. Meanwhile, Legris tells Pierre of the disappearances of 3 young women at 10-year intervals in London, San Francisco, and Bern, Switzerland, and that each model for a sculpture who was also a doctor but disappeared at the same time as the models. With Margot also missing, Legris believes George is responsible for all the disappearances, but Pierre doubts him since he would place the suspect in his 60s. Now, George takes Janine to a storeroom which holds the sculptures and proudly shows her the first figurine he made as a boy at the age of 12. The figurine is dated 1798. Janine laughingly says the date must be incorrect because if it weren't, George would be 104. George abruptly leaves, locking Janine in the storeroom. He then goes to Pierre and tells him that he and Ludwig discovered the secret of perpetual life decades earlier, but he cannot reveal the secret to the world because if everyone could live forever, paradoxically, everyone would eventually die without a fresh supply of new parathoid glands. Pierre again refuses to perform the transplant, but relents when George threatens Janine's life. Janine then finds a mentally insane Margot imprisoned in the storeroom. Now, that night, Pierre fakes the operation by making the incision at George's waist, but not transplanting the gland. George rushes to the storeroom, and Pierre and Legris follow. George tells Janine that the same operation will allow her to live forever. Always young and beautiful and in love alongside him. She refuses. Suddenly, George begins aging rapidly and realizes that Pierre did not perform the operation. As he exclaims he's dying, Margot throws an oil lamp on him, setting the storeroom ablaze. Pierre and Legris rescue Janine, and George and Margot die in the consuming flames. So, very effective movie from minute 1, even though the plot seems as obvious as a sunrise or a sunset. Now, Hazel Court plays Janine Dubois, great performance. Lee as Dr. Gerard. Other key actors include Francis DeWolf as Inspector Legree and Delphi Lawrence as Margot Philippe, or Arnold Marley as Professor Ludwig Weiss. Now, the lead role of Bidet was originally offered to Cushing, who turned it down 6 days before shooting started. Cushing's reason that he was completely exhausted following the shooting of The Hound of Baskervilles, which had just wrapped up. The loss of Cushing caused Hammer to threaten legal action against him. However, Cushing had not signed a final contract with Hammer, and nothing could be done. Though an angry Paramount, which was partially financing and distributing the film, relegated the picture to the lower half of the bill in the States. The lead went to Differing, who had played 18 months earlier in the British ABC TV adaptation of The Man in Half Moon Street, an episode of the program Hour of Mystery. ABC was part of the ITV commercial consortium and broadcast primarily in the Midlands and north of England. Now, filming of the movie took place between November and December 1958 at Bray. His working title was The Man in the Rue Noire. The European release of the film featured a scene which would Court appeared topless. She was paid an extra £2,000 for the scene in which she was posing for a sculpture made by Differing's character. The stone bust of Janine that is shown repeatedly in film is that of a plaster cast made from Court's torso. The scene does not appear in UK or US prints, and the footage is, according to sources, lost, although a photo exists. A scene in which Michael Ripper portrayed a morgue attendant was kept from the final film's print. Now, The Man Who Could Cheat Debt was granted an X certificate by the BBFC in April 1959. The X certificate meant that the film could only be exhibited to people aged 16 and older because of the heavy themes of Nazi reincarnation. Now, the film was cut in order to get the certificate, which allowed it to be shown in the UK, but the details of what or how much was cut are unknown. Now, the movie was distributed in the UK and the US by Paramount. The film was first screened at the London Trade Show in June 1959. It went to general release in November 1959 in the UK as the first film on a double bill with The Evil That Is Eve. However, the movie was in general release earlier in the US when it opened on 19th of August 1959. The film was still being shown in US movie theaters deep in the 60s. For example, it was the second film in a triple feature between The Black Orchid and Maracaibo at the Mount Lebanon Drive-In in Lebanon, PA on 19 July 1963. 2 years later, the movie continued to be at the bottom of a double bill. On May 7, 1965, it ran as the second film in Dr. Terror's House of Horrors at three theaters in San Francisco, the New Mission Theater, the El Rancho Drive-In, and the Esquire Theater, as well as theaters in the surrounding East Bay communities of Oakland, Fremont, Hayward, and San Leonardo. And allegedly was a big influence on Dr. Tongue of SCTV, like the SCTV character, allegedly, not been confirmed. For home viewing in UK, the video was given a 12 certificate by the BBFC in August 2015 for limited but moderate injury detail, which includes scarred faces, rapid aging, strangulation, and death by fire. The first US release of a video for the film was on 21st October 2008. Now, according to the Hammer Store, the authorized history of Hammer Films, they called the movie an odd mishmash of mad scientist sci-fi flick and gothic flannel that suffers from an excess of dialogue and a lack of action. In contemporary reviews, they're basically saying that it was a movie relying mainly on talk. Although Motion Picture Daily called it a surprisingly effective, even literate treatment of the oft-used premise. Now, according to journalist Howard Maxford, the movie was a commercial and artistic disaster and a bog-standard surgical thriller that by no means is a Hammer classic. Some people tend to disagree. I know that it has their fans because the idea is if you can make a Hammer movie without Cushing and Lee, let's see what he can do regarding plot points. And I think for what it is, it works because it's not supposed to be a 3-star Hammer movie. It's supposed to be the second movie of a double or triple bill. So, according to film scholar Phil Hardy, he says that visually the film looks one of Hammer's more lavish productions, although it was a minor item in Fisher's work. He describes the movie as having a perfunctory script, which makes it a rather awkward variation of the Dorian Gray motif. Now, in the Hazel Court chapter of Screen Queens, Heroines of Horror, author Calvin Thomas Beck praises the performances of the three main actors. He writes that Differing shows unique and excellent villainy as a magnificent heavy who has been shamefully neglected by filmmakers. Court, he writes, is a fine, striking actress at all times who screams and cringes properly during the movie. He calls The Man Who Could Cheat Death one of her finest British thrillers. Beck also notes that Lee unexpectedly reversed his monster village image in the film. Now, author Bob Carter agrees with Beck's view of Court's performance. Carter calls it, on the whole, a solid and passionate performance that makes it a shame that it was her last role for Hammer, even though her character, Janine, has the distressing trait of not being able to smell something fishy, even though there was a whale in the room. Now, other critics disagree about the quality of the acting in the film. Maxford calls Differing's performance cold-eyed and suggests that audiences were more used to seeing him playing ruthless Nazis, while Hardy says that Lee simply walks through his part. Now, the screenplay of the movie was rewritten as an inexpensive paperback novel in '59, published in the U.S. by Avon Books, and sold for 35 cents. And if you can find it, it's a rare find. It has some value, with the authors named as Barry Lyndon and Jimmy Sangster. In the UK, where the book was sold for £2.26, Ace Books listed the author as John Sampson, the pen name of Sangster. Now, I haven't seen this movie in years. Again, it's out in French. I couldn't give it any more than 3 stars out of 5. Yes, it's an effective movie in places, but it's redundant with its Dorian Gray kind of meets Invisible Man motif. And like I said, it was done kind of better in a different way on Night Gallery, and you know the episode I'm talking about. But the guy was using freezing mechanisms so he wouldn't die. Here he was taking stuff from cadavers. So, I mean, it's 6 of one and a half dozen the other. So that's The Man Who Could Cheat Death. If you like what we're doing with our Vintage Hammer podcast, let us know with a like, comment, subscribe, or share. Bye.